I now invite for his statement His Excellency Alexander Pankin, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. The Vice Minister of the Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the Russian Federation staunchly advocates the immediate lifting of what was imposed 57 years ago, the United States blockade of Cuba. We categorically repudiate the U.S.-led anti-Cuban sanctions campaign. This, in our view, is not an issue of bilateral relations, but rather the protracted, egregious violation by Washington of international law, above all the core principles of the United Nations Charter. We view the discriminatory and the illegitimate practice of extraterritorial application by the United States of its national legislation as a grave threat to the whole system of international relations. These acts undermine the pillars of global and regional stability and raises force as a diktat, as a norm of international relations, American style. The question lies in the following: who will become the next insubordinate party, so to speak? For life amid sanctions today is a reality not merely for Cuba and not merely for Russia, but essentially for a third of countries worldwide. The sanctions war has been unleashed by Washington for the achievement of its overriding goal to unseat the inconvenient Cuban leadership and to punish it for its principled position in support of the legitimately elected president of Venezuela, Mr. Maduro. This is a stark example of egregious foreign political pressure in the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine. This treacherous intervention in domestic affairs of a sovereign country tramples upon human rights and humanitarian values. This blockade has been wreaking havoc on Cuba's economy. Think of the figures. Since April 2018 to March 2019, damage from the embargo has amounted to $4.34 billion US dollars, and the aggregate damage in all of these years has surpassed 922 billion US dollars. The US has turned the economic noose and wrapped this around Havana, having prosecuted foreign companies for the transit of oil from Venezuela due to fuel shortages. Flights to Santo Domingo, Mexico, Cancun, Caracas, Port-au-Prince, and other countries have been halted. This has led to Cuban airline passengers being reduced by 40,000 only in the past year alone. Obstacles have been erected to thwart scientific and technical potential of the country through an export-re-export ban of products with more than 10% share of U.S. parts. Of any telecommunications equipment. The Cuban transport and logistical infrastructure has been derailed through the ban on its leasing aircraft and naval vessels. There's been damage done to tourism due to the prohibition on the entry of cruise liners from the United States on its shores and the introduction of other visa restrictions. The most sensitive issue of the anti-Cuban campaign unleashed by Washington is the humanitarian front. This embargo is the main barrier against the full-fledged enjoyment of human rights in Cuba, above all, healthcare, education, and food security. We are appalled at the fact that this cynical U.S. pressure has obstructed the efforts of Cuban doctors in many developing countries, as well as the pharmaceutical industry. This has imperiled the health of thousands of ordinary people who use Cuban medicine. Essentially, Washington has embraced a policy of slowly seeking to introduce a genocide and targeting the Cuban people through stepping up sanctions and stiffening the trade, economic, financial, and energy embargo. Washington has obstructed the integral right of Cuban citizens to a dignified life and embracing its own socioeconomic development. There is evident hypocrisy from Washington. On the one hand, Washington publicly supports the core principle of Agenda 2030 to leave nobody behind. On the other hand, the United States has stiffened the blockade, causing millions of ordinary Cubans to endure deprivation. This U.S. policy of unilateral sanctions is not supported internationally. The whole developed world, unlike Washington, does not see a threat in the development path that has been embraced by the Cubans. Adapting domestic political economic systems, introduction of economic engagement with other countries is a demonstration of Cuba's openness both to reform and cooperation with the international community. Washington has ignored this constructive key role of Cuba and its having warranted authority. We reject this, which undermines the core principles of international law, which fans the flames of confrontation war-wide. This illegitimate measure runs counter to common sense insofar as it flouts the interests of American society and business themselves. Russia has always stood in solidarity with the fraternal peoples of Cuba in surmounting the difficulties that have arisen as a consequence of Washington's sanctions. We have underpinned these with wide-ranging economic and humanitarian cooperation and with the delivery of assistance for the development in the island of freedom. We shall continue to do so. In a reaffirmation of our steadfast position, we will again vote in favor of the draft resolution calling for the immediate lifting of the blockade without preconditions, guided by the core principles of the United Nations Charter about the inadmissibility of any discriminatory measures undermining national sovereignty and intervention in domestic affairs of states. Thank you.
I thank the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for his statement.